What a debate, and great to see this dynamic going on the continent as we're walking our way towards COP27. It was great to listen to those decision makers on the policy level, on national governments. And now for this, I think now it's maybe the right time to also consider, we have been talking a lot about the national policy frameworks, and we know how they're important to enable change on the ground. But who is certainly another enabler on the ground is the private sector. And I feel we have not talked enough about the private sector until here today. And this is why we are now coming up with a private sector showcase, sustainable mobility as a business model. So we have to acknowledge that the private sector plays a vital role. It has to provide the solutions on the ground that help us shift to low carbon sustainable mobility. They need to make their investments because their money is needed. It needs to be put in the right places. They need to create jobs, and obviously they need to create returns for their investors. So with the right frameworks in place, this will certainly work. And we reached out to invite innovative African companies, very young ones still, who are deploying testing their business models and trying to grow, to tell us what are you doing and what are the experiences you're currently making on the ground. And out of all those applications we actually received, you will find more about those companies on the website, where we have the private sector showcase online as well. Out of those, we invited for today to present and to share with us what they're exactly doing. And I'm happy to welcome representatives from across the continent again. We will hear from Benin, from Zimbabwe, from Kenya, and from Egypt, what mobility solutions they are developing, if it's in the urban or the rural context, if it's on electric mobility or on data, and what else. So while we're having this session, I invite you to take our next poll, which is on which mobility innovations will break through in the next decade in Africa. So please be numerous to respond and share your view with us as we move on through the private sector showcase. Also, please keep in mind, you can always post your questions in the chat. We will go through the presentations here first. I will invite one after the other, and then at the end, we have time to address your questions. So please post them in the chat. And now I'm looking forward to hearing from our first private sector company, a really young startup still on the African continent, coming in from Benin. And I would like to hand over now to Zed Motors. Olou, can you hear me?
Yes,
great to have you.
Can you hear me?
We are looking forward to learning more about Zed Motors. So what is your company doing?
So Zed Motors design and assembler. We distribute robust electric 2- and 3-wheelers that are made for the African terrain and geared toward those who use motorcycles to make a living. We don't believe in disregarding the old or existing technologies, but we build on them. Zed Motors make the familiar advanced. There are companies already with centuries of experience making motorcycles for African drivers, and they are actually very good at it. So Zed Motors works with century-old bike manufacturers to combine the robust parts with our proprietary electric components and smart pay-as-you-go battery. This makes the world's most robust electric motorcycle so far. In order to accelerate the transition to e-mobility, we work with existing gas stations to set up battery swapping stations that are mobile and simple. Next slide, please. Now, how to take all of this to market? A lesson we learned from our experience trying to mainstream solar energy in the off-grid West African context was to include women. In general, in most of our villages, people trust a woman salesperson better than men. People trust a woman who dare install solar panels on roofs better than a counterpart men technician. People trust women drivers than male drivers. And here is an example. A question for us all. especially those of us living on the African continent. If you have a choice between a male driver or a female driver, who will you pick to take your kids to school? I mean, this might sound like a discrimination, but it's just pure business. We launched a program called Zed Women, where we recruit and train women to use electric motorcycles to enter the delivery service business. Restaurants, supermarkets, and service providers all want to subscribe, but they insist on being assigned women drivers. For us, it makes business sense, and the news is spreading fast. Next slide, please. Whatever social or environmental impact agreement we make, we still have to make this affordable. One way we found to make our e-motorcycles competitive to the gas, petrol, ICE motorcycle ones is to offer pay-as-you-go and battery leasing service. In the pay-as-you-go model, the user ends up owning the motorcycle and the battery. Whereas in the battery leasing model, the customer only owns the motorcycle and rent out fully charged batteries whenever they need it. Both purchase models are working, and one works for one segment of the market and the other for another segment. We are launching in Togo next month. Next slide, please. And we will be in Mali by August or September. Next slide. We have plans to enter the Nigerian and Moroccan markets. Here you can see a picture of a police officer in Benin riding one of our sport motorcycles. We work with police departments, governments, as well as telecom companies and ride-hailing business services to offer them on lease to own our electric motorcycles. Next slide. Electric mobility can only be made accessible to the masses if governments get behind with concrete actions. For example, we need to avoid the messy, competitive mistakes and the fake to low quality products we saw on the market during the solar energy era. Those in the sector that know what I'm talking about. Governments need to set up norms and certifications now before it's too late. We need to work together with our governments to develop standardized system for battery and battery swapping stations, and we need to harmonize the charging process. Some countries, like Benin, have set in place policies to support the adoption of e-mobility. Such policies, for example, tax and duty-free, free industrial zone that favor climate enterprises, increase in tax for ICE petrol vehicles. We believe that other countries need and can follow suit. There's more that can be done. Our big takeaway so far is that we can go fast and very far if we learn to go together. Thank you.
inspiring presentation, and also your strong take on gender here. That is really interesting, and I would like to go back to this later after we've seen the other presentations. And also maybe I hear that you're going to expand in other markets, so maybe this is your place to make a call to all those who want to invest in your business. Just make use of the opportunity to reach out to people, could be worthwhile trying. With this, I invite our next speaker, who's Shantha Bloemen from Mobility for Africa from Zimbabwe. Shantha, are you with us?
I am, yes. Thank you very much for having us. And my colleague was meant to join today, but he unfortunately is tied up on technical issues with batteries. So you have me instead.
Always business is first, Shantha. We completely understand, and we are pleased having you instead. So the floor is yours. Please introduce your company.
So I'm Shantha Bloemen. I'm the founder and managing director of Mobility for Africa. We're a startup working in Zimbabwe, in Southern Africa, and we are focused on rural mobility. We're trying to solve the last mile mobility crisis for rural communities using e-tricycles and battery swapping with a fleet management system. If you could start my slides, that would be great. So I think just to give a context, I know most of the e-mobility companies currently are focused on urban, and obviously in large parts of the continent, East Africa and West Africa, we've had a boom in two-wheelers. And so obviously, now moving to electric two-wheelers makes absolute sense, and the business case is already there. What we've been trying to do is to prove that there is a viable business case for rural transport, and not only is there a financially viable case, it needs a patient approach, but the social and economic consequences of investing in that type of infrastructure will have catalytic impacts on agriculture. And I think we need to remind ourselves that while we've seen urbanisation increasing, most of the continent is still rural. In Zimbabwe, 70%, and I would say that figure is consistent in a lot of Southern Africa and many other parts of the continent as well. I would also say that if you look at rural transport, we have a huge deficit. And why does this matter? This matters because agriculture is the largest employer in the continent. Most families are small-scale producers, and so transport has a huge direct correlation to what they grow and where they sell and their economic livelihoods. It also has a dramatic impact on local economies and other types of service delivery. And finally, I think, everyone's been focused on food security, and it's a huge reminder that we can't afford to not invest in rural and make agriculture where we give people the livelihoods they need to be sustained. Next slide, please. So what have we been trying to do? We've been actually trying to get people to rethink some of their assumptions. And I think e-mobility is such an exciting opportunity because we don't have to all of a sudden be dependent on fossil fuels, which, as we know, in most African countries are imported and expensive. So with renewable energy and the huge investments going into rural energy generation, we have a huge, enormous opportunity to leverage. And we've been focused on a three-wheeler tricycle. Why? Because essentially women do most of the heavy lifting, and they usually have to carry heavy loads. What we know is a two-wheeler serves a great purpose, but a three-wheeler, which carries 300 to 400 kilos, lets them carry their kids as well as their tomatoes and everything else they need to usually carry on their heads or their backs or in a less safe and secure way. And what we've been also trying to do is leverage into what is a global trend. Shared mobility is happening in Europe. It's happening in North America. We've seen it with Uber. Why can't we try and focus on rural areas and think through the aggregate spend that the communities already face? All of our research, and we've done a lot, demonstrates that people spend 20 to 30% of their income on transport. And if it could be more efficient and more reliable and directly correlate to incomes, then that people will spend. Next slide. So I'm just going to give you quickly some case studies. One of the things we've been really trying to push as we speak to investors is to question the assumption that rural is poorer. What we see in Zimbabwe, which is definitely a challenging country at times, there is a vibrant rural economy, and what we have is outgrower schemes. So most small-scale farmers are tied to the market by selling something. Some of them have formal agreements, and I'll talk about dairy in a moment. But one of our groups, we have a shared rental model at the moment. We have different types of business user cases for the different rural constituencies, and we invest in a charging station and then a fleet of 50. We're just building our third fleet of 100 to test that technology. It covers a 30 to 40 kilometre radius, and the three-wheel tricycles then can be used in different ways to service different segments of the market. So it's not a simple, straightforward business model, but it definitely means that you're leveraging that aggregate spend on transport, which is 20 to 30%, and it means it is ultimately viable. So, I mean, these three women share a tricycle. They have fields that they collectively grow horticulture, and essentially the Humber has transformed their productivity. They now can get to the market, they can sell more, and the incentives then to grow more are there because it's not sitting and rotting where they can't get it to market. Next slide. At the moment, MFA, Mobility for Africa, we're busy moving to the eastern part of Zimbabwe. We've signed an agreement with the Dairy Association. There are 8 dairy companies, for example, in Zimbabwe, just to give you an example. And basically, we have a blended financing mechanism where we have a matching fund from a development partner, and we're just in the process of negotiating potentially the other 30% to be financed through a bank. So what we often get is that, you know, the informal economy, the rural economy is unbankable and people don't have any faith in their ability to repay. Here we've de-risked that because essentially the dairy farmer has a huge need to increase their ability to transport their milk. Most people can only carry a 20-litre jar on their head. So, for example, Violet now can deliver 160 litres of milk directly to the factory with the Humber, which she sells for 50 cents a litre. So she already is desperately waiting and wanting, and there are lots of Violets who are very successful farmers but have a huge challenge in last mile mobility. I think I lost the next slide, but we also have transport and logistics. We've set up rural transport and logistics services, and once again that is a way to make sure that people can get to the clinic, can move around. We're looking at a B2B model with service delivery. We've been testing with the rural clinic. They are the best performing clinic in the district. They've set up 7 mobile health points where they go and vaccinate, from COVID to under 5 vaccines to HPV. They can pick up pregnant women. They can take, it directly correlates. And as many clinics across the continent are getting installations of off-grid energy, there should be no reason that e-mobility can't be integrated. Next slide. Quickly, just I think on the policy recommendations, we've been working closely with the Zimbabwean government to hopefully get them to adopt an e-mobility policy and roadmap. I think what we've got lots of small markets in Africa. That's always one of the challenges for any business to scale. So we need coherence on standards and regulations. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. And I really hope that the AU can take some leadership. I know we have our regional trading blocks and some of them are better integrated, but essentially for us to really influence and shape and fend off the flood of secondhand cars that potentially are going to come to the continent, we need to have a much higher level coherent leadership. We need to educate policymakers and use this opportunity that this is not just a way to meet the Paris agreements and reduce carbon emissions, which of course is critical, but it's also a way to rethink transport. The continent has, 44 per 1,000 vehicles on average. We have a shortage of transport. We have a mobility crisis, and with the potential of electric and shared mobility, we can really solve both the urban and rural transport and the catalytic impact it can bring. I'm also a believer that it shouldn't just be urban and then rural, which is often what I get told. I think there's no reason that we can't do both. The capex is heavy, but you've also got to remember that if you invest in a system and it lasts for the 10 years, and as we've seen, you watch incomes increase, then you will have the catalytic change that hasn't happened essentially in rural areas that we need to have happen quickly. I also think, unfortunately, there's always a danger to think of four-wheelers, and policymakers will be, looking at the OEMs and the Teslas and the big companies. We really need to make sure we have an inclusive approach, and inclusive means looking at regulation, registration, licensing for 2 to 3-wheelers, and avoid barriers to entry. Safety is important, but what we know often happens is, it's very difficult for rural people, women, to get a driver's license. It's incredibly difficult for annual registration, and usually it's not. It's going to deny the sort of scale up we ultimately need quickly to have a real change in the continent. Thank you.
Thank you, Shantha. I really see here how you're raising the profile of the rural community and linking the development of sustainable mobility to the broader sustainable development context. And as we just said, it's not just about gender, it's about rural, and it's about also affordability to access to mobility. So great that we see those young companies evolving on the ground. We actually all asked them to provide their advice for policymakers. So on the last slide, if you are policymakers, listen carefully what would be helpful for them so that their business can prosper and thrive on the grounds. And with this, we go to our next speaker, who is from the company Arkwright. I invite Felix from Kenya to introduce his still very young company to us. So what is Arkwright doing, Felix?
Hi there, thank you very much. Yeah, my name is Felix Saro-Wiwa. I'm operations manager here at Arkwright, and we were founded an electric vehicle company, founded in 2020, and we started Kenyan operations in January 2021, starting in Nairobi, and that's where I'm currently based. Our overall objectives quite lofty, but it's to build the leading Pan-African electric mobility company through the creation of affordable, reliable, clean vehicles and best-in-class battery swapping infrastructure. And we're going to do that through an EV ecosystem approach, which is where we build connected vehicles, charging, and technical backend all together and all at once. Next slide, please. For the couple products, I wanted to just focus on two specific parts of our ecosystem, and the first of which is a battery swap locker. The battery swap locker is fully automated, and to my knowledge, it's one of the first in its kind in the region. When I say fully automated, that's either a QR code or a Bluetooth connection, as you may be able to make out in the top right corner of the picture provided there. So a rider will approach the swap station, they will scan the code or use their Bluetooth to connect. That will tell the locker to open up the free locker. The driver will put their depleted battery in the locker, and that will open up a locker containing a fully charged battery. This will be supported by an app which has the ability to track the battery swaps and allow riders to visualize where in the city there are available charged batteries on a map display. The charging locker itself, or the swap locker itself, has a very clear display showing the state of battery charge and the number of available batteries in each locker. It's a very simple installation with no messy wires creating health hazards, tripping hazards, or electrical fires or anything like that. And it's just a straight grid mains connection. There's the ability to connect solar PV to each of our swap lockers, which we think is crucial. In Kenya, we're fortunate enough to have a grid which is largely renewable based. However, in terms of scaling and with our ambitions to move throughout the region and even throughout the continent, we think that creating something that is solar PV compatible allows an end-to-end renewable system contributing to the low carbon economy. We think this is a much better user experience than charging. And while it might be tricky for now, rolling out and getting people into the mindset of swapping rather than charging, we think long term it's going to be of best benefit to the user base, and we're laying the foundations for the future, not just for now. Next slide, please. The second product that I wanted to talk about was a personal commuter vehicle, which is not in fact our first or main product this year, but I think it presents a really interesting use case. So we think post-COVID, people will want to move away from the close contact shared transport that currently pervades Nairobi and other East African cities. We think this is sort of mirroring an Asian model, where a personal transport vehicle is maybe a more dominant mode of transport than shared transport even. We're designing this in an R&D project, both ourselves alongside Musashi Seimitsu and a Japanese R&D firm and Sondiro. And we're planning for a 2023 launch and pilot. Crucially, this vehicle we think is going to be targeted at females with a safe and steady design and emphasis on driver experience. And we think this will give more autonomy in commuting and general transit and allow options to move away from being on the back of a motorcycle, which is dangerous and perhaps unpleasant, as well as another option is maybe being in the back of a matatu, which is very cramped, crowded, and again, not so much of a pleasant or safe experience. Of course, this vehicle, as with the rest of our products, is fully electric, and it's supported either by a solar-based charging system or even a grid, which in Nairobi is 90% plus renewable. Next slide, please. Thank you. In terms of our future plans, we have 250 electric boda, so motorcycle type vehicles, arriving this month, and we think they'll be assembled mid-June next year, and we're going to roll those out. We're going to sell them to financing companies who will then essentially leverage their large rider base and do a hire purchase form of sale to them. Following that, we're going to look to scale up production capacity. So we're looking to have be able to assemble 500 vehicles per city per month. And when I talk about per city, that will start in Nairobi and we'll be expanding quickly after into Kampala. So aiming for a Q3 2022 launch. Next slide, please. In terms of policy recommendations, I wanted to only focus on charging because I think that's of greatest sectoral benefit. So the low-hanging fruit is tax exemptions, but I think there's a very straightforward recommendation where we mirror the solar equipment tax exemptions and import duties and those sorts of things. I also think government could facilitate or incentivize PPAs with solar companies. That could allow a really interesting model where a mall or a restaurant or petrol station or any sort of large sort of infrastructure in the city could be powered by a PPA solar project, but also power the charging station, which will give cheaper daytime electricity and will make it renewable in all countries. So perhaps even moving away from necessarily relying on an EV company like ourselves to install our own charging stations, going one step further and putting PPAs in at the same time. Of course, if a government is able to allocate public land, perhaps on a long-term lease rather than an outright sale or grant, allocation of public land is going to be a premium in these inner city areas. So for a company like ourselves, even having a small amount where we can fit our charging locker would be invaluable. Reducing tariffs, both for home charging and for a business tariff, would also be of enormous benefit in reducing the cost of essentially a swap, which is already lower than the cost of petrol significantly, but there's no harm in driving it even further down. And there's a potential even for a nighttime tariff. In the example of Kenya, there's an excess of renewable energy produced overnight through the geothermal and the hydro renewable projects powering the grid. And so if we're able to sort of leverage those nighttime charges and essentially use that renewable energy, that could potentially even be a source of an even cheaper tariff. That requires a lot of technical sort of back end where an IoT device from the battery is able to show the source of the charge, but we're working on bringing that in for that eventuality. So thank you very much for listening to the fairly brief presentation, and follow our social media channels if you want to keep updated on everything that we're doing.
Thank you so much, Felix. It was also interesting to see how strongly you link to the energy sector, and I would suggest you be prepared for a question in this direction later when we have the joint debate. So for now, we've heard about rural and shared and electric transport. Now we would like to hear about data in transport. And with this, I'm turning to Egypt, and I would like to invite Mohamed Hegazy from Transport for Cairo and learn about the use of data. What exactly is your company doing, Mohamed?
Well, fantastic. Thank you very much. Pleasure to meet you all. Hello, bonjour, guten Tag. And yes, I am speaking to you on behalf of Transport for Cairo. We are a strategic advisory consultancy based in Egypt and have been operating for the last 8 years. And is my presentation showing? I'm not sure. I assume it is showing. So we are, yes, there we go, fantastic. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to reimagine public transport as it exists in practice today in Africa. It's dominated by microbuses, the ones that constitute what some call the informal sector, others paratransit. And what we do is we envision and enable transforming informal transport, and as you so eloquently mentioned, through data. Next slide, please. Let's go on a journey. Our first station is going to be the problem, the baseline. Where are we now? We started in Cairo, and in Cairo, informal transport moves 2/3 of Cairo citizens every single day. And all over Africa, it dominates transport provision. This picture is from Old Taxi Park in downtown Kampala in Uganda. And there it's almost 100%. It's either a microbus or boda boda. And 100% of the system is this informal system that is dominated by driver micro-entrepreneurs. We need to understand these are like small micro companies that provide the capital to move urban residents around, but it's too little capital, and that's why we get the old cars rusty, and it's a challenge in the age of electrification. They provide access to jobs and opportunities for the citizenry, but in terms of efficiency, it can be made better. Often they result in a lot of traffic congestion. And finally, they contribute a lot of emissions. Local air pollution often suffers. It's a very acute problem that we need to fix today. And we need to look at the long term and about the emissions that are going to be growing and the lifestyles that our urbanizing African cities are adopting. So moving on to the next slide, please. Where do we want to go? What is our terminus? What is our final destination? Well, the vision that TFC promotes is a socially equitable, environmentally sound, and opportunity-generating urban mobility system for developing markets. How do we want to get from our first station to the end station? What's the journey? What's the route? Now, we develop a technology, we call it Route Lab. This is our software platform and app with which we collect the data, and it's the one that underpins all of our consultancy projects, of which we've had 45 so far. We produce maps. We started by mapping informal transport, creating the first GTFS feed of Greater Cairo, but we've also did it in 5 other countries in Africa, cities in Africa, in 5 countries. And these maps are digital. They enable trip planning. They enable Google Maps on your phone. And if we go to the next station, the third one, first we get the maps and the data. Next slide, please. And the next station is to manage these operations. The maps contain a ton of operational data points. They allow us to perform really deep and granular analytics at a level that hasn't been possible before. They allow us to identify inefficiencies. Gender, for instance. Informal transport networks tend to favor traveling from home to work and back. By the network design, where the routes start, where they end, which streets they take, at the expense of trips to the nearby schools, trips to residential areas where people live. The latter are the kinds of trips that women do probabilistically more than men, which tend to travel more on the home trips. And this is a very subtle, invisible gender bias that we can then see in the data. And we can also see how we can fix it. And this is where The technology and market solutions come in from the network insights and the route analytics and allow us to really envision how to improve operations substantially. And this takes us from the second station to the final station. Next slide, please. The transformation of the sector. We need to enable a better contracting system for this informal system than the basic one that we have now. We need to contribute to sector formalization. And I use this word very carefully. Sometimes we don't want to formalize it. Informality brings a lot of strengths, but we want to corporatize it. That means have them as small micro entrepreneur companies that work with better rules of the game. We want to organize it, recapitalize it, and transform it. And specifically, we're focusing on three themes. The first one is decarbonization and allowing the system to access the capital necessary to electrify or at least move to zero emissions vehicles. We need a change management, and it's a really tricky process because e-buses don't solve anything. We need to transition the labor value chain much more than the vehicle value chain. And digitization is the key that enables all of this. And this is where our software platform hasn't been developed yet. This is what we want to go. And we believe that tech always supports this projects that we work on, but the technology is never the solution on its own. Next slide, please. So I want to talk to you to a very quick case study from Cairo. Map, manage, enable. The first station is the mapping. We started in 2017 with funding, the same funding that Transport for Africa got, by the way. And we created this first data set on Google Maps. And then the World Bank came in and was like, this is useful, let's use it for planning. And then we started, next slide, on a master plan with the World Bank for the Ministry of Transport. Then we did a project for the benefit of the ministry, doing a feasibility study using this very same data on doing a BRT on the Cairo Ring Road, but also on how to transition the existing informal industry. We did Egypt's first SUMP in a new desert community that's part of Greater Cairo, Sustainable Urban Mobility Plan. And this is really moving from, next slide please, the management to the operations, the transformation. Well, there is only a small visible part of the transformation that happened, which is that we designed the maps, the actual physical signage inside the Cairo metro, improving the passenger information and linking it to the digital one available on Google Maps now. So we really improve passenger information directly. And indirectly, by working on an e-mobility strategy and by developing the smart contracts concept, we're moving on the long-term sector transformation that will take a long time to do. And to the final slide, please, the three recommendations for policymakers. Map, map, map. The data, we need the data. Apply for grants to get this data. Join DT4A, Digital Transport for Africa. This is a platform that we were lucky to be part of the co-founding team of. It's managed by the French Development Agency and the World Resource Institute. We're doing a big project with them in which we're helping 10 cities use our tools and do the mapping themselves because it's an essentially local activity, the transformation, and invest in the necessary data infrastructure that allows you to manage your operations. And that's the second piece of advice. Value the incumbents, value the informal sector that's there. It has 10 and 20 interesting strengths that are very effective. And only by managing these stakeholders, even if they're informal and not the ones that government authorities are usually used to dealing with, they can bring a lot of value to the table. And finally, the last one is enable the transformation. And in an age of climate change, electrification, zero-emission vehicles are going to be part of it. Enable it through access to green climate financing, which is a result of having the data and creating the baseline and the improvements, the CO2 savings that are possible to be mapped out in the transformation. And finally, enable the transport workers, because no transformation will happen without transitioning the labor value chain before transitioning or parallel and with transitioning the vehicles themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mohamed, for taking us through the world of data and how valuable it can be to tackling mobility challenges and providing us with more resilient and effective transport systems. So now I like to invite all of you to our panel. So I'm going to see you appear here on the screen. And I have a couple of questions, obviously, from my side, but also from the chat. And but let's go back to Olou. And the way how we're going to proceed here, I have a couple of questions that could basically be answered by everybody, which addresses business building and deployment of your products and services. But let's start with Olou. I believe you're the youngest company, but you're quickly expanding into other markets. So there's one challenge in rolling out solutions in the first country. There's certainly more challenges in moving into others. So how do you prepare? What are the obstacles you're prepared to find if you move into other African markets with your product?
Okay. Yeah, thank you for your question. This is a great question. So, okay, first of all, a lot might be thinking we are young. We started in 2012. We're one of the first solar energy, solar off-grid, solar home system company to establish in Benin and later in Togo. So we are building this e-mobility program off of our experience with renewable energy. And today we say that electric mobility is more about access to energy for mobility than the mechanical engineering part of making a motorcycle. So let's not try to be in the business of making motorcycles. I will always say that. It's not our expertise. None of us has a background in making motorcycles. There are companies on the continent. Today, I don't even see Bajaj. Where's Bajaj here? Bajaj is, I think, number 2 or number 1 in the most popular motorcycle on the continent. Where's TVS? I don't see TVS. We need those players at the table. They make the most robust chassis, the most robust shock absorbers on the bikes. And today, there's no electric motorcycle made for Africa. None. There's not a single company making electric motorcycle for the continent. So by working with existing manufacturers, we can move quickly because they are already well established. And then second, once we have a system that's already standardized, we can replicate by working with partners in each country where we set up shop. So we don't go into a country and reinvent the wheel, and also we don't know about that country as much as their own citizens know the country. So for example, in Togo, the most popular motorcycle in Togo is Haoju brand. I'm sorry to be talking about these brand names, but it's important. In Benin, for example, it's TVS. In Nigeria, it's Hero. So we use what people are mostly used to, familiar, and we add the advanced part to it. So it's not shocking for the market. When they see a Bajaj gas tank or frame, they're like, the taxi motor drivers are like, oh, Olou, finally, you made our motorcycle now. That's kind of how we are able to be expanding fast. But we're still meeting a lot of challenges.
This shows that there's also this gap, right, that you can fill in, and maybe with different capacities, and to finally develop this for African-built motorcycle. You also mentioned again the energy sector, and this brings me back to the question I already had in mind to Felix, who's also seeking very strategic partnerships with the energy sector and the renewable photovoltaic solar production to feed your battery chargers. So how do you go about tackling this very monopolistic sector? In many countries, it's driven by few operators, but decentralized solar production has just such a big potential. So how do you build up those partnerships?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And perhaps given more time, would have been able to give some more context. So essentially, we have a very similar background to Zed yourselves. We come from, essentially, we're a sister company outright from Arc Power. They're a solar mini-grid distributor in Rwanda. And so essentially we have evolved from looking at increasing productive use in the solar mini-grid communities to then looking at electric vehicles for that purpose, to then looking at Kigali, to now moving to Nairobi. So essentially we would look to perhaps leverage on that existing partnership and the network that we have from there.
So it's all about using those networks and building those partnerships. And now I would like to go to Shantha. I mean, we know that you also work on the distributed energy, but you are in an area where we would not see in the first place that, okay, this is going to be a money business, right? It sounds a bit like it's more a social business, but still you managed to get access and leverage finance. So what would you recommend other companies who are in their young stages? So what is needed to get access to this finance?
Well, no, it's been a 3-year journey to de-risk rural populations, which I find very upsetting, because if you look at what is happening in rural Africa, there is so much potential. I mean, Zimbabwe, for example, agriculture is the growing sector. It accounts for 40 to 50% of the country's GDP, and it's everyone's livelihoods. So I think we need to rethink rural in different ways, and I think we need to take the subsistence farmer and stop thinking about just the subsistence farmer and start thinking about small-scale producers, there's 100 million small-scale producers, family farms on this continent that seem to be undervalued. But I think what's interesting is, just like we're talking about fleet management, we're looking at financial partners, and we want the big banks. We don't want microfinance, because once you get into the e-mobility space, the capex costs are high. But if you look at the trends in fintech, everyone wants to access the unbanked and to reach the informal economy. And if you look at what's happening, for example, in Southern Africa with the off-taker agreements that happen, whether it's in dairy, where every day that farmer is selling 20 litres of milk, if they can increase that to 60, there's a clear incentive, and they're going to be bankable. So I think it's a matter of creativity in the way we start looking at business models. I don't think that's there. I think just building on what was said about brands and what is fit for the African market, I think the challenge is R&D, and the challenge with e-mobility is it's capex heavy. It's an upfront cost and investment, because you need the charging and you need the motorbike or the tricycle. And we need to develop technology and ecosystems for the continent. And I'm hoping that some of the big players, both in the OEM space but in the development sector, start actually taking longer term risks, because this is an ecosystem that needs, we need to invest in making sure we've got components and recycling and all the other elements. But it's so exciting because it's a huge job creator as well. So we're currently operating on a very fine budget, but we're at the brink of now really, I think, using the evidence to say, come on, guys. Yes, partner with solar producers, but also with agricultural businesses. They're sitting there. They have a mobility problem. They know things rot before they get to the market. Solve it with green solutions.
Thank you. This really sounds inspiring, as if there's a whole new idea of business model concepts coming up that we actually need to move forward with this transition. So I have a little task for you, because we're such a dynamic panel here. I think it would be good. Why don't you think of a question that you would like to ask one of your partners here in this round, and we will get back to you in a minute. I would like now to make use of Mohamed's knowledge about data. And we hear a lot about open data, risk of use of data, data privacy, et cetera, et cetera. How do you see this? Is this a government topic? Is it a private sector topic? How can we deal in a good way and sustainable way with data for transport?
Well, fantastic. Honestly, I think that it's really, how they say, like, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Let's say that data issues are in the eye of the beholder, because when we talk about data privacy issues, which obviously are a very big thing in Europe because of the GDPR, they're also a very big thing because we're talking about social media and we're talking about personal tracking and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But when we are talking about mapping the routes of public transport networks, this doesn't include any kind of personally identifiable data. So the layer of the data that we're talking about is so much different. When Shantha talks, for instance, about access to market and prices, etc., there are no data privacy concerns there. So we need to be careful about what issues we are raising and what issues are non-issues in the context that we are operating within. So I don't really worry about data privacy. In our line of work, we never used data that is personally identifiable, such as cell phone data, etc. When we do, it tends to be through suppliers that are already pre-anonymized. So again, we are not liable under GDPR. And sometimes we do surveys, like for now, we need to do household surveys. And these are the ones where data privacy is suddenly very important. But this is just clean research. This is just doing your work properly. So it's a different discussion. Now, if we talk about open data, I think that this is the really important, interesting one. Because when we started in TFC in 2014, the idea was to create the map, launch it as open data, and follow this ideology that was very much on vogue back then, that once the data is out there, a developer community will spring up and start using it. And that second part did not happen. And this is how we became from just a data supplier and working from the tech focus, because we believe in the scalability it provides, into a fully fledged strategic advisory, because we need to work vertically from collecting the data from the very beginning, because it doesn't exist, and forget about going to government and asking them for the data. The capacity is not there, all the way to the final policy recommendations and what ought to be done and what needs to be done, and the analysis in the middle, because the ecosystem is still very much emerging and it needs this capacity push to take place. I hope that gives you a little bit of our experience in that space.
Certainly, it shows like this, as you're saying, everything is emerging and we're in a shifting environment. And now as we have you, the four who are so dynamic and so convinced and ambitious in their businesses, I think it would just be a great opportunity to also kind of exchange amongst each other, maybe ask your colleagues here for certain experiences that may be helpful for your next steps in your business. And well, now, who would like to go first and who has a question for whom?
I would love to ask Mohamed just about the data again. Your case study showed how you got leverage in Cairo from more, uptake from World Bank, and did that translate though into more investment in hardware? Because often there's a lot of focus on software and digital data. There's always a big sort of gap in analysis and how we use that data. But have you had success, and how do you see that success translating into actually the big bucks going into subway systems or bus systems or fleet management systems in rural areas?
That's an excellent question. Thank you. I believe the short answer is yes. There's this saying that I really appreciate, which is you always overestimate what you can do in 1 year, and you always underestimate what you can do in 5 years. And I think that this is really the crux of it, because when you have the data and you start showing and telling the story and the narrative, most people don't really understand the data, but they will pick up on the story that the data tells. And this is then the skill that really matters. And when you start telling the story and it starts sinking in, slowly, you can see how the paradigm shifts, and there is a development cycle. It takes a good 5 years to bring a project from conception phase all the way to construction start phase. Startups try to condense it to a couple of years or even months, but then it depends on the scale of it. And when you're talking about public transport infra, it's long by definition. And yes, we have seen that, because suddenly the conversation is very different. Because when the microbuses were invisible, they weren't even taken into account. And the question of investing in them or even transitioning them wasn't even asked, because they're invisible, because the entire report and plan and strategy is focused on what's visible, which is the formal system, the 4,000 buses and the 3 metro lines. But then the 40,000 microbuses, once we counted them, once we showed their routes, once we showed that on this route there are 40 different routes competing, what if we combine them into the BRT route? Suddenly it became a question of combination and not of replacement. And this is the paradigm shift that I think we have been able to achieve and are continue to working on.
Thank you, Mohamed, for this very comprehensive answer. And who is next? We have about 6 minutes left, which means like we have 2 minutes per second, 2 minutes per person. Yes, Olou, go first, please.
Yeah, I have a question for Ark. It's Ark, right?
To Felix, yeah.
Yes. Yes, I'm curious about your battery swapping station, and my question is to know like how many batteries in the station? That's first question. Do you have IoT enabled to collect data on the batteries, and maybe have an app where riders can know the station process with a fully charged battery? One, and then the second question is how quickly can you deploy in a town of let's say 50,000 inhabitants?
Yeah, first of all, I wanted to, I don't know, I think it's great to see another company, almost a mirror image on the West African side, to us, going down the swap route. I think that's fantastic, and I think it's very easy to go, not very easy, but perhaps a more straightforward route to go down the charging. But yeah, I think swapping is great. So yeah, my commendation to you guys. Yeah, so we have essentially developed the first 7 lockers, so the one that I've shown you there, and then 6 others we're trialing right now. And they have sort of smart meters enabled. They carry, well, they have the capacity for 12, but there always needs to be one free, so they'll have 11. And essentially they are version 1. But what we're working on in version 2 is having a lot more back-end connectivity. So things, data such as the amount of charge going into the charging locker, the amount of charge being discharged to the batteries, as I mentioned in the presentation, the source of the charge itself. So whether it's come from renewable, whether it's come from grid, solar, whatever it may be, lots of those other things. So all 3 of the batteries, the charging lockers, and the vehicles will have their own IoT device and give their own unique data. So we're developing that alongside a Chinese company, and we hope our version 2 of the locker will be even more high-tech and future-proof. In terms of deployment strategy, well, we're looking to roll out about 200 or to 250 charging stations for Nairobi, for the sort of inner city and just outside of the city limits of Nairobi. And that's sort of the scale we'd be looking to do that in an ideal world. We'll do that in the course of a year, but as Mohamed said, startups, that perhaps might take a bit longer. We'll see. But as soon as possible, we're laying the charging infrastructure even before rolling out bikes. So that will be sort of there in place for whenever our bikes or any compatible bikes on our system would like to arrive in the market.
Great to see how you guys exchange from one edge of the continent to the other on the same topic. Felix, now you're talking. Who goes your question to, and what is it? Be quick.
Well, boringly, I was going to ask a question to Zed, and I think one of my biggest concerns is about the culture of swapping, and how maybe if you guys have thought about how to incentivize a rider to go and do a swap, which may cost a little bit more than a charge, but will be far more convenient for them in the long run. You know, is that something you guys are concerned about in West Africa? Is it not so much of an issue, you think? And maybe what have you done to address it?
Yeah, thank you for your question. That's a great question. So we have 2 segments, right? So we have most of the time workers, people who go from home to the office, and then sit at the office all day and then take the motorcycle back home, like telecom service employees and things like that. Those, and then even like police officers, those they buy the bike on pay-as-you-go and with the battery, so they can charge anywhere they want to, on the grid or anywhere they want, at home, at work. And then we have the taxi motor drivers that can afford to own the battery. Lithium-ion battery is expensive. So the structure we have for them is pay-as-you-go on the bike, which is now the same price with the petrol IC motorcycle bike that they are used to buying already. So what we say is you rent out battery. And then the cost of renting out battery, for example, 130 kilometers is the autonomy for a whole day of fully charged battery for them. And they use about 110 kilometers a day. So that they still have some battery life left. So what we have in pricing is cheaper than them buying gas for a day of work. So it's cheaper for them to rent out battery than purchasing gas. And that's kind of how we are operating. And it's easier. In Togo, gas price is higher than Benin. So the model also works even better in countries or setting where gas price is higher.
We have an almost identical system to your second solution there, so good to see.
We'll be talking more. Yeah.
It's good to know that solutions are applicable in so many places on the continent. Unfortunately, we have no time for a last question to you, Shantha, but what I believe is that you guys can all connect. This was the intention of the sessions. And please also go to the networking room afterwards. The audience, please go to the networking room, meet our young companies, those innovators in sustainable mobility solutions on the African continent there. It was a real pleasure for me having you in this dynamic panel, and thank you for taking off a little bit of load for my moderator's job. Thank you for being with us today, and we are looking forward to seeing how your companies evolve in the future. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.